So I look at this and say that there are so many imponderables, other than the one thing that is not imponderable is that the Rexford Guy Tugwells, the totalitarians, the technocrats, will be in this up to their elbows. However it plays out, they will be trying to use this for the most nefarious purposes one can imagine.
Here at Liberty and Finance, we're licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. We are standing by the inventory, ready to make sure you get what you need, even into the wee hours of night and on weekends, because preparedness doesn't stop. Call us 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We're honored to have this returning guest. Dr. Edwin Vieira is a constitutional attorney. He's joined us several times before to clarify positions about sound money. He wrote the book Pieces of Eight. He's also a Second Amendment advocate and explained the proper role of the clause in the terms of our relationship to government as free people. He talks and writes extensively about the proper relationship we have with our government and with our maker. He joins us again this Friday, April 22nd, 2022. Dr. Vieira, thank you for coming back on Liberty and Finance.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
Whenever we have you on, people often write afterwards that if they've seen you for the first time here, they say, where did you find this man? We need him as a counselor to our president and our Congress. We need him on this channel more often. So we have you back on a recurring basis. The thing that motivated it this time was an article that came out calling for people to get behind what's being called the calling of the Convention of the States in order for the states of the United States to reclaim some of their power from the overreaching federal government. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis says, quote, I know the states need to use Article 5 to take power away from D.C., he said. Quote, the permanent bureaucracy will never voluntarily give up an ounce of its power. I encourage all other state legislatures to support the Convention of the States project and pass the resolution today. And I right away forwarded that to you and asked you, is this, in your experience and in your opinion and knowledge of the past, is this the right approach and a helpful approach to restore a proper balance of power between the people, the states, and the federal government, or is this opening a Pandora's box? And you said right away, without hesitation, that you would like to weigh in on this, and I value that response, and we are eager to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I certainly agree. I maybe not agree, but I'll take up the point that this is a Pandora's box to the second power, the third power. It's a snare and a delusion. Let's remember, how many times have there been amendments proposed to the Constitution in the past? All of them, as it were, standalone amendments. They dealt with one particular subject. So we're up in the 20s somewhere of constitutional amendments. And that procedure, having a single amendment that specifies a particular change or addition to the Constitution, allows people to focus on that one issue. Now, a constitutional convention, what they call the Convention of the States, is designed to set out a whole slew of amendments. Nobody knows how many. And then those would all be dumped together for some sort of ratification process. Now, you can imagine the level of confusion and dissension and doubt that there would be as a result of doing that. Because now we're looking at proposed amendments 1 and 2. What happens if we ratify those, but we don't ratify amendments 6 and 7? Are they interrelated in some way? Could there be some element of contradiction if we do this but not that? The whole thing is open to very problematical political discourse, all right? But let's go back to the origin of this idea of having some kind of constitutional convention that would have a kind of supervening power over the entire Constitution. You can go back into the 1930s, probably even earlier than that, but 1930s example, Rexford Guy Tugwell, one of the original technocrats that was associated one way or another with the Roosevelt people. And he proposed a thing called the New States Constitution, which was entirely designed to centralize government in a technocratic structure. And that's still out there. There are people who are still proposing that, or large segments of at least the substance of it. We have contemporary technocrats, cultural Marxists, assorted totalitarians who are in favor of having some kind of convention of the states. Why? Because they believe that amendments that are suitable to their political persuasion will be proposed and perhaps adopted. And then we have a lot of naive patriots. And unfortunately, I think maybe DeSantis is one of these people who expect that, oh, no, the patriots are going to control this constitutional convention. The constitutionalists, if you will, are going to do that. And the only thing that will come out are amendments that actually limit the government of the United States in the direction of personal liberty, economic rights, free market, so forth and so on. And I think this is an extraordinarily naive position, because the patriots in this country, the constitutionalists, have been consistently out-organized, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered by those so-called community organizers. Remember the one who became the president of the United States, or was the resident of the White House for 2 terms? The community organizing these various activists. And those people will certainly be involved in this constitutional convention. From some of the states, at least, you will have the Obamaites, the Bidenites, the Nancy Pelosiites, whoever they are, all right? The existing problem that we have with the government of the United States, and actually the government of not a few states as well, is imposing accountability and responsibility on public officials, which the electoral process doesn't do. The same people, or the same types of people, keep getting elected over and over again, and they prove themselves to be unaccountable and irresponsible. We need enforcement of the present Constitution, which is basically non-existent, right? And history has shown us, I think, that enforcement cannot be had within the government of the United States itself. That control is too entrenched in these 2 anti-populist political parties, Republicans, Democrats, the administrative state, which DeSantis was worried about, and rightly so. And then, of course, behind all of that, the deep state of outside forces, the globalist corporations, the big NGOs, the UN, and all the hangers-on there, and so on and so forth. And so I asked the question, what is the point of enacting new amendments, even if they were worthwhile amendments, if they are to be no more enforceable than the Constitution we have now? Something which we wouldn't find out until years down the road. Right? You pass some new amendment, and the effect of that amendment is not going to happen the next day. It's going to happen over months and years, perhaps, court decisions going back and forth, all sorts of, the infighting of politics, before we discover whether those amendments actually are worthwhile in the sense that they make a change. And so my question is, if you're going to any kind of constitutional convention, what's the First Amendment that you should be proposing? Well, it would be an amendment that would give some kind of guarantee of enforcement of itself and any other amendments that including the amendments that are already in the Constitution. Let's just take the Bill of Rights. How about enforcing those? All right? That's what I want to see, and I have yet to see someone propose an amendment that does that, or an amendment that is not capable of being invaded. Because remember, in the final analysis, what happens to these amendments? Right? Somebody takes action under them, say Congress, and then it winds its way through the courts, and we discover that often, the courts come out with a decision on the meaning of an amendment, which is contrary to the actual language of the amendment. Heaven's sake, isn't that amazing, right? Now what do we do? Now what do we do? Well, what is the only guarantee of enforcement? Well, who wrote the Constitution originally? And the Declaration of Independence. It was we, the people. The Declaration of Independence talks about the good people of the colonies, as opposed to the bad people, the Tories, right? And then the good people, calling themselves we, the people, wrote, ratified, adopted this Constitution. And remember what Franklin said when he comes out of the Constitutional Convention, the first Constitutional Convention. And the lady asks him, Mr. Franklin, what kind of a government have you given us? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. Not if it will keep itself, if you can keep it, if the people can keep it. This is the duty of the people. So what we actually need is to have a recrudescence, if you will, reinforcement, reapplication of federalism, popular control in enforcement of the Constitution. And we can have that. And I don't want to get into great detail about this, but we've got a provision in the Constitution which deals with the militia being composed of the body of the people in every bloody state, right? It's already there. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15. Militia is given the authority and responsibility to execute the laws of the Union. What are we talking about there? All the laws that apply to the Union, they're talking to at the level of the government of the United States. All of them. Right. I'm not going to get into how that can be done, but it can be, and it should have been done a long time ago. Right. But nobody ever talks about that. Nobody ever says, well, there's an enforcement mechanism right there in the Constitution. The militia will execute the laws of the Union. Where is that execution taking place? Well, it isn't. Why aren't we doing that instead of talking about pie in the sky, fairyland castles, Disneyland-type castles of amendments? And the answer is, well, I guess nobody really wants to go back to the point that the people are going to run this country. Maybe that's it. Maybe even the DeSantis politicians don't believe that the people themselves should run this country. But let's leave that anyway. Okay, the states could demand this. They could put this in effect right now without a constitutional convention or without even a new single standalone amendment of the Constitution. And here's an interesting thing. If there are enough states to try to stop a constitutional convention becoming a runaway in favor of the totalitarians, which is the thing that I fear. Right? I fear that the community activists and organizers will be the ones that actually dominate and control the direction of any constitutional convention that is started. And how you stop that is the problem. We could do the opposite. We could deal with this militia question, execution of the laws through the militia, because we have the militia in every state. I mean, there is some statute that deals with it in every state. It's not too difficult to show how to use it. We have the actual constitutional law providing for using it, and we don't need anything more than the will to do it. So I leave it there. All right, let's get into the Constitutional Convention itself. The first problem is the structural problem. Who knows how this Constitutional Convention will be structured and operated? And that brings you back to Article 5 of the present Constitution, which deals with this whole question of amendments. And it says, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. So that's what they're talking about, having the legislatures of the states apply to Congress so that Congress would call a convention. And there's the magical word. Congress will call a convention. And what does Congress have as its power of call? What does a call include? Well, could Congress decide all the details of the convention, such as who shall attend, that is, the selection of delegates, the rules of order, what those will be, whether the convention will deal only with amendments that have been previously submitted by the states, and which ones of those, or the convention will be able to deal with any amendment that is proposed at the convention? Can Congress decide whether the states will vote on a one state, one vote basis, or on the basis of population as they do in the Electoral College, so that each state will have a different number of votes? Can Congress decide what majority or supermajority will be necessary for a proposed amendment to be adopted by the convention? And I ask the question, if Congress could not claim to do those things, why not? Where is it defined in the Constitution what this power of call would include? And I would think typically when somebody calls for a meeting, they say who's going to attend the meeting, what the purpose of the meeting will be, maybe what exact discussion will be allowed, or presentation, so forth and so on. Usually the call is not going to be, well, guys, all come on, we'll talk about it when you get here, right? So there certainly is a pretty, I won't say sound, but strong argument that Congress can do all these things. And assume Congress does them. And people object, say, well, this was improper. This isn't what should have been in a call. Where does that question go? Well, it goes eventually to the Supreme Court. It might start in the Supreme Court because some state might invoke the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. But it gets to the Supreme Court, right? And now we're back in exactly the same problem that we've all been worried about, that we have constitutional provisions which, taken all the way to the Supreme Court, prove not to be enforceable, or they prove to be enforceable in a perverse way, right? In a way that people say, wait a minute, that couldn't be what the Constitution means, but that's what the Supreme Court says it means. So we're stuck in that circle again, right? And of course, would the Supreme Court actually intervene in some way to limit the power of Congress to define this call concept? Now, we're talking about the same Supreme Court that didn't bother to inquire as to whether the last presidential election was constitutionally valid, right? You think they're going to weigh in on what Congress can do in terms of calling this convention? Say, well, it can do this, but it can't do that? Well, I don't think so. And then look at this in light of what I would call the dismal state of Congress. Look at the people who are and the types of people, not just the ones who are there, but the types of people that are in Congress at the present time. Do we want or any Congress which we can realistically imagine actually being in office, deciding all of these procedural and maybe many of the substantive particulars of a constitutional convention? Do we want AOC, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer? Let me run down that list. You know, you run down whatever list you want on either side of the aisle. Do we want those people making these decisions? We don't have James Madison, thank you very much, right? We don't have Patrick Henry, George Mason, Alexander Hamilton. Those aren't the kinds of people who will be making these decisions. It's AOC that will be making these decisions, the squad, right? Okay, and what if after Congress sets up whatever call it sets up, the convention turns out to be a runaway convention? It goes outside of the procedures that Congress has enacted. It sets some of its own rules. It proposes its own amendments, which no state had proposed before the call, and so on and so forth. Would the Supreme Court intervene in this and stop it, control it in some way? Is this now going to become something that the Supreme Court will be doing as is outside of Article 5, which Article 5 talks about Congress and the states doing these things, and all of a sudden we get in a situation where the 5 members of the Supreme Court are going to decide what's going to be done? Is that what people have in mind? And which 5 members of the Supreme Court, thank you very much? Is there actually a 5-member majority that could be counted on by these naive patriots and constitutionalists? With Roberts there? Let's just take him as an example, right? Of the Janus figure. He can look in both directions at the same time. So there you go. And what if there were a proposed amendment which would, in effect, substitute an entirely new constitution for the one we have now? Well, why couldn't we have that? Let's say we had an amendment that said, strike all the words after we the people and substitute the following, whatever the following would be. Would that be an amendment of the Constitution? Of course it would be. So people look at this as if to say, well, there's only going to be these interstitial changes. Excuse me, it could change the entire document. And there are people who want to do that, the community organizer type people. And what if the convention decides to create a new mode of ratification for a set of amendments or some new constitution? Now you look at the old Article 5, right? Amendments are to be ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states or by conventions in 3/4 of the states, depending on the mode of ratification which may be proposed by Congress. Oh, well, that's fine on paper. But what happened when the original Constitution was prepared and ratified? The delegates were sent pursuant to the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation, Article 13, said that the Articles of Confederation could not be changed without unanimous decision by the legislatures of the states, the 13 independent states. So out comes the Constitution of 1787, and it says not that there will be a requirement of ratification by all of the legislatures of the states, But it says the ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states so ratifying the same. That's Article 7. All right. So can you imagine that might happen again? That this new convention would come up with some new form of ratification, just as the original convention came up with a new form of ratification. And it might say, for instance, that this new Constitution would be valid if, 26 states ratified it or 30 states ratified it by conventions. And they did, expecting that the other states would be compelled by political economic pressure of one kind or other to join, which is what happened the first time around. And I think of the example of Rhode Island held out to the bitter end, but finally was pressed because of its political economic situation into ratifying the Constitution. So you have the same situation here, right? And probably more pressure this time than the last time because of the interlocking nature of our economy throughout all the states, right? You think of those original 13 states, it's possible that some of them could say, well, to heck with you. We're not going along with this. We can do just fine independently because our economies are such. But they didn't. Now I think that would be extraordinarily difficult to imagine anyone doing it. And then the question arises, what if that happened? Would the Supreme Court step in and stop it from happening, or would it simply dodge the issue? And what if the ratification occurred before a case arose that could get to the Supreme Court? That's fait accompli. Then what? Right? So all of this is unknown. And I don't care what anybody predicts. Predictions are worthless once this happens, right? No war plan survives contact with the enemy. If you know that expression, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You can have a wonderful plan here and say, well, this is going to happen. That is going to, and my gosh, it's exactly the opposite. Especially if people are in that Constitutional Convention with a goal of superseding the present Constitution, if not by large numbers of amendments, then entirely by creating a brand new Constitution, the Rexford Guy-Tugwell New States Constitution idea. And then I look at some of these constitutional amendments that have come out from the so-called patriots. And I think of one of them, which really struck me, I think it was a family rights amendment that essentially said that the rights of parents to control and direct the education, health care, and so forth and so on of their own children would not be infringed unless there was a compelling state interest in doing so and the government was acting with the least restrictive means. Now, this is something that wasn't invented by the people who wrote that proposed amendment, this compelling state interest, least restrictive alternative test. This was invented by the Supreme Court long ago. It's had various names. This is the one that was settled on. They call it a strict scrutiny test. The problem with it is it's anti-constitutional. You don't find it in the Constitution, obviously. It's something the courts invented. And it's anti-constitutional because it says that the courts, actually the legislature, the executive, and ultimately the courts, because the courts make the decision finally, the courts can overrule, nullify a right which is stated in absolute terms, that is, without any qualifications or limitations, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Take that as an example, right? The right of free speech is another example. You can take those. They have no qualifications. They have no limitations written in the Constitution. But the court can allow for limitations, restrictions, if the legislature typically, or maybe administrative agency, whatever, executive branch, comes up with a quote-unquote compelling state reason, compelling state interest. Well, what's that? Who decides what's compelling? Who decides whether it's a governmental interest at all? One would think that the first and highest governmental interest is to obey the Constitution, not to circumvent it. But we're now told that isn't true. All right? So that's number one. The government is going to decide, even if it's just the Supreme Court ultimately, the government is going to decide whether it has a compelling interest in overriding the very document that limits its ability to act in a certain way. And then the least restrictive alternative, well, what is that? who's to determine the level of restrictiveness? The fact of the matter is, even the least restrictive alternative restricts. So the bloody thing is illogical. It's self-contradictory. Right? But there it is. Now, the courts have gotten away with this for years or decades, for heaven's sake. This is now standard practice. And here's some fool putting this into a constitutional amendment so that you'll never be able to get rid of it. So you could get rid of it now. You could have a Supreme Court say, well, this is all bunkum, and we're reversing this. All of these decisions were wrong. This compelling state interest test, least restrictive alternative test, this is anti-constitutional, and we're not going to allow it anymore. Fine. That would be excellent. But once it's written into the Constitution, now it can't be changed, right? Why would anyone in his right mind write this into the Constitution? Even in one amendment, because if it's written into one amendment, the courts will simply say, well, you see, there's the principle in this new amendment, Amendment 32, and we're going to say that that applies across the board. Because there's nothing special about Amendment 32, really. It's stating an idea that the courts have been enforcing for decades before this thing was written. And so now all of a sudden, this anti-constitutional method of judicial review becomes constitutional. Is this insanity or what? I mean, I looked at that and I said, my God, what were they smoking when they wrote this thing? But there it is. And that's on the patriot side of the ledger, thank you very much. That was, I saw that in at least one amendment that was talking about, as I said, promoting parental rights, which is one of the big patriot concerns, right? That's DeSantis right now, talking about what's going on in the schools there in Florida, right? Enforcing statutorily there, but he wants to enforce it constitutionally. Right? And here they are in the very amendment that they're trying to protect these rights. They're sanctifying for all time this utterly phony anti-constitutional theory that the courts have expostulated. It's madness. All right? And then what about the dangerous amendments? There are going to be amendments coming from these community organizers, from the Rexford Guy Tugwells, from the technocrats, from the totalitarians. And they may not say that they're trying to impose totalitarian power, but that's going to be the effect of them, especially once the courts get their hands on them. What about all of those dangerous amendments? How can they be kept from being proposed? How can they be stopped if they are proposed, whether before the Constitutional Convention or within the Constitutional Convention if it becomes something of a runaway Constitutional Convention? What are the guarantees to keep those things out? Well, there are none. Right? By hypothesis. Some states are going to propose, because they're California, New York, Massachusetts, they're going to propose wacky, technocratic, basically totalitarian amendments. They may propose them beforehand. They may propose them within the convention once it gets going, but there's no way to stop them. And then it all boils down to who are the delegates and what kind of promises or threats or whatever are going to be made within that convention. Right? All the political horse trading that we're so familiar with in Congress. You think that's not going to happen within the convention? It'll be worse because the stakes are higher. What's the control mechanism? Well, there's none. Especially there's none if they arrange it in such a way that they set out either a set of amendments, interlocking amendments, we have to accept all of them, or a brand new constitution. The new state's constitution, Rexwell Guy Tugwell, take that as an example, the new state's constitution. This is what comes out of it. And now all of a sudden, there it is. And especially there it is if they say, well, only 24 states have to ratify. They might get 24 states ratified. I mean, this is so dangerous. This is like playing Russian roulette with a semi-automatic pistol. You understand what I mean? Okay, with a revolver, you've got 5 shots, a 6-shot cylinder. You drop one cartridge in, you spin the cylinder. Okay, there's 1 chance out of 5, 1 chance out of 6. With a semi-automatic pistol, there's always a round in the chamber, right? The first person that plays the game shoots himself. And that's what we're talking about here. This is a sure suicide, political suicide. That's my view of it. Nothing good is going to come out of this. If they had amendments, the Patriot group, because I don't want to talk about Rexford Guy Tugwell's group, if the Patriots have amendments that they think are so vital, then propose them one by one. Right? Lay that out. Don't create a complex, convoluted, confused situation which the Patriot group is probably not going to be able to control. They're not going to be able to control it at the congressional level because Congress has all of this authority that we have to worry about, the call, so-called. They're not going to be able to control it in terms of what amendments are proposed either before the convention or during the convention. And it is not unlikely that they won't be able to control the way the convention is run. And perhaps whether something comes out of that convention that looks like a brand new constitution with a ratification mechanism that is sufficient to get it ratified by the blue states. And then where are we? Right? Aren't they bound by that? They agreed to it. They went, they may object to certain parts of the action and take those to the courts. And what happens if the Supreme Court says, well, we're not going to exercise jurisdiction? We don't have to hear a case, even if it's a case in our original jurisdiction. Or the Supreme Court says, well, we can't do anything here because the Constitution actually gives the power to Congress. Or the Supreme Court says, well, we can't do anything here because this is the same thing that happened at the original Constitution. They changed the ratification procedure. And we're not going to question that because it's already been ratified. Remember, a court case takes years, potentially. Right? I say, well, this would be a fait accompli, and here we are now. And now we end up with a Constitution that, at a minimum, would have this compelling state interest, least restrictive alternative thing as a fixed element. We will have destroyed the Constitution to that extent. We can't even argue against this anymore because now it's part of the Constitution. But I would imagine that they would have stricken a lot of other. I would imagine one of the first things that would go would be the Second Amendment. Absolutely, got to get rid of that. And the way the attitudes of these woke, if I may use that term, the woke group in society, which is anti-free speech, you can imagine that there would be limitations on the First Amendment. Oh, we can't have quote-unquote hate speech. We can't have speech that incites. We can't have speech that upsets. Whatever words they would use, some open-ended limitations for their courts now to be able to silence everybody else. You'd have that. Certainly, they're not going to give you any kind of, one of the main reasons for this was to balance the budget. Balance the budget. Going to have a balanced budget. Are they going to have a balanced budget amendment that gets rid of the Federal Reserve System and goes back to sound money? You're going to have a balanced budget provision that removes the borrowing power of Congress so they can only spend money they actually tax? Think of some things that would force a balanced budget. Right? You can't borrow. You have to tax. You don't have a Federal Reserve System tied into the Treasury that can allow you to float endless amounts of securities at trillions and trillions of dollars worth of debt. You remove all of that. You think they're going to put that in? Will that be the balanced budget amendment? Of course not. So you know right off the bat that the original idea for this, which was the balanced budget concept, is undoable. Because to have a balanced budget, you've got to either have no borrowing, and then you would still have to have sound money because you don't want to be able to tax in paper currency, right? Or you'd have to have a system where you were on the sound money standard, the gold and silver standard, and so your ability to borrow would be constrained by the marketplace. The interest rates would go through the roof, and you wouldn't be able to borrow. You certainly couldn't use a central bank running a fictional fiat currency as the basis for this. So you have to get rid of the Federal Reserve. Well, none of that. So none of these people who talk about balanced budget amendments talk about any of that. The last thing they talk about, if at all, I've never heard them talk about it, but I can imagine, the very last thing they would ever talk about would be getting rid of the Federal Reserve. And that's the key to the whole problem. So I think the whole thing is unrealistic from the point of view of the good ideas that people might have in terms of limitations they want to put on the government in Washington. It's naive in terms of how simple it would be procedurally to run this thing. It could be extraordinarily complicated. And it's childish to think that their opponents haven't already thought through how they're going to gain procedural and substantive control and come out with a set of amendments or a new constitution or whatever that would change this political system that we have in an unalterable way in the direction of totalitarianism. Because we're living in a dream world. And if they're so sure that they have amendments that are the people want, we the people, right, the good people, as the Declaration of Independence would say, then propose them one at a time. What's the problem with proposing one at a time? That's what I don't understand. Right, one step at a time. Let's see what we can propose. Let's see what the attitude of the public is to it. Let's see if Congress will, the Congress we have now will go along with this, whether the legislatures of those 3/4 of the states or the conventions of 3/4 of the states will actually pass that one new amendment. Look at the Equal Rights Amendment. There's an example. Equal Rights Amendment was a bad idea because people look at it and say, well, how far will this go? We don't know. This is so open-ended. This is worse than Pandora's box, because Pandora's box at least had a limited amount of volume, I assume, right? But this Equal Rights Amendment was just completely open-ended. And where is it now? Well, it's still sitting out there. It was never ratified. Because they looked at that one thing and said, we're going to focus on this, the difficulties we see, this is too dangerous. No, we're not going to ratify it. Now, it becomes a completely different story when all of a sudden half a dozen amendments are proposed, and some of them are tied to others. That is, if you to get this one, you've got to have that one. That's worse than Pandora's box, obviously, to me. It's a whole set of Pandora's boxes. One is like nesting, Russian nesting dolls, right? So I look at this and say that there are so many imponderables, other than the one thing that is not imponderable is that the Rexford Guy Tugwells, the totalitarians, the technocrats, will be in this up to their elbows. However it plays out, they will be trying to use this for the most nefarious purposes one can imagine. And they are much more sophisticated and competent at political infighting and manipulation and maneuvering than the Patriot Constitutional Group. So the Patriot Constitutional Group should never put themselves in a position where it's possible that they're going to be outnumbered, outmaneuvered, outvoted, whatever, by this other group. And that's why the single amendment is a much better proposition, because all right, the blue states might vote for it, and the red states will vote against it. But there's that 3/4. We know what it is, 3/4 limitation, 3/4 requirement. It's going to be presented as a single proposition, and you fight it out on that basis. And at least you know what's on the table. Now we have no idea what's going to be on the table. Even the proposed amendments that a lot of these naive patriots put forward, the ones that, well, these are the amendments that we're proposing. Why can't the convention change them? Right? That comes back to this whole call question. And I have seen various gurus saying, well, all Congress can do is, like set the date or something, and states do the rest of it. Really? You think that's what a Nancy Pelosi House of Representatives, a Chuck Schumer Senate is going to restrict themselves to? Or are they going to use that word call in a maximum sense to be able to control as much as possible the procedure, that is, who gets to go, how many votes each state has, et cetera, et cetera. I covered all of that. And the substance. Which proposed amendments get in the front door, or or would other proposed amendments be allowed through the back door after the convention has begun? And then the final question, of course, is the one that worries me the most, because it happened. We know it happened once before. The change of the ratification procedure. Now, I can't see how they could stop that, even the courts, because there was a limitation in that first instance. There was that limitation in the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were the controlling document at the time. Article 13 said you had to have unanimous agreement of all the legislatures of the 13 states in order to change the articles. So one would have thought, oh, well, that's definitive. They can't go beyond that. And they did, by proposing this new constitution and changing the ratification mechanism and limiting that ratification mechanism to become effective if 9 states went to it. So you conceivably could have had 9 states operating under the new constitution, and they also would have been operating with the other 4 states under the Articles of Confederation. And of course, that would have been an impossible situation, and that's one of the things that drove all of the states ultimately to ratify the Constitution, so that it turned out that they all had, in fact, gone along with Article 13. Because it was unanimous. Finally, when Rhode Island came in, it was unanimous. Well, that would be the same under the Article 5. They could create some other ratification mechanism, a new constitution, 25 states, 30 states, whatever. Those 30 states would do it, and then eventually other states would come in because of the economic and political pressure until they had 3/4, which is the present Article 5 situation. And that would be that. So you can see all of these possibilities, or I can see all of these possibilities. I look at it and I say, oh, my goodness gracious, this is just too frightening. This is like the little child that's worried about the dragon under his bed. Right? Well, the dragon actually is there in this case because we have a very large, influential group of people in this country, well organized, who want and will try to use whatever procedure is involved in this Convention of the States to radically change the Constitution. That is their goal. And I'm afraid they're going to be successful. And so I would just stay away from it. There are amendments that are sound, put them out one by one. You will never have the Rexford Guy Tugwells and that group lay out their new constitution as the amendments. Come forward and say, well, we want an amendment that will put in this whole new constitution. They'll never do that because people will look at that and say, oh, my God, we're going to shy away from that immediately. That's too frightening. They'll never do that. But this is their way of accomplishing it with this very complicated, convoluted mechanism. And if they come out with a new ratification procedure and they have enough so-called blue states to ratify it, that's it. Sayonara. And now you're in the technocratic world, controlled by those people, controlled by the people who gave you COVID-19. Okay, controlled by the people who gave you all the things that DeSantis is against in the public schools. I don't know. Do people want that? Yeah, if they want. Hey, the interesting thing is, if they wanted that, if people wanted that, they could have that right now under the present Constitution because that's the way the present Constitution is being interpreted. Didn't we have Fauci doing these things? Don't we have the Commerce Clause giving all sorts of powers, the Obamacare under the Commerce Clause or the whatever, right? We already have that. But obviously, the technocrats fear that they can only go so far because to the point at which people wake up to what's happening, right? And then people will come back and say, oh, no, you can't do that. There are limitations in this Constitution. We'll begin to see a revival of constitutional limitations. Well, once we have our new Constitution, our new Rexford Guy Tugwell, new states Constitution, all those limitations are gone. Family law, people. Let's remove this limitation. Let's impose this compelling state interest. Let's restrict to alternative test as constitutional. Oh, thank you very much. Right? Why didn't you just jump off the edge of the Grand Canyon?
This may be a perfect time to springboard into some viewers' questions because one of them is right on this topic that you just brushed up against there about bureaucracies having taken over functions of government that were not provided for explicitly in that manner in the Constitution. William Mueller asks, Fauci says the CDC is above the courts. How does the Constitution address government agencies like the CDC, DHS, IRS, etc.?
Well, the CDC is not above the courts. It's certainly not above the executive, not above the president, not above Congress, for heaven's sakes. Not above any. The CDC, all of these administrative agencies were created either as part of the executive branch to help the president perform some executive function that's laid out in the statute, or essentially as agencies of Congress. Congress passes a statute that's couched in general terms. And the administrative agency is there to write regulations to fill in the gaps. On the theory that, well, Congress can't address every possible situation. It can only give us generalized statements in a statute. And then the administrative agency is performing this subsequent function of dealing with sort of the case-by-case basis, right? And that goes all the way back. I mean, John Marshall, I think, is responsible for that one, this idea of filling in the gaps. But theoretically, at least, those agencies which are legislative or using what they call quasi-legislative powers, well, they're, of course, directly controlled by Congress, or theoretically. Congress doesn't do it because it can't look at all of these actions by agencies. The Federal Register is thousands of pages long. Congress isn't reading that every day in order to discipline these agencies. And the same is true in the executive branch. You have agencies that are performing executive functions, and the president is not in a position to control all their actions. Now, I come back to the militia. I mean, that's why you would use the militia, right? You have an agency, and you put in a supervisory element in that agency made up of people from the states in the militias, all right? And that supervisory agency would do nothing other than make sure that those agencies were operating in strict accordance with whatever mandate they had been given by statute. Right? What happens now is the agency does something, somebody sues, and it goes into the judicial system. People usually don't go, sometimes they go back to Congress and say, well, this should be changed, but typically it goes to the judicial system. And it gets up to the courts, Supreme Court eventually, and they say, oh, well, we are going to defer to this agency if there's any reasonable basis on which the agency could have come to this decision and taken this action. We, the judiciary, will accept that because they are the experts. See, we come back to technocracy. They are the experts. They know more than we, the judges. And therefore, we're going to give them essentially the benefit of the doubt and accept what they have done. Now, of course, if they go beyond some, limitation, reasonable limitation, then it's a different situation. Now, the problem with what Fauci said is it's complete nonsense on its face, because it's always true that an agency action is subject to judicial review, although the judiciary may say that they are going to defer to the agency's expertise. But that case is still there. The judge is still making a decision, right? In my view, he's generally using the wrong standard of deference, but at least he's making a decision. The agency doesn't come there and say, we can do any damn thing we want, and you can't say anything about it in the court. That's right, case dismissed. Wrong. Right? Now, in the case of the CDC especially, these people are trenching on some fundamental constitutional rights and ultimately the Nuremberg principle that you can't experiment on non-consenting individuals, adults, let alone children, right? So Fauci's got a lot of problems here, because at the constitutional level, the courts don't have to accept the factual determinations of the agency. See, Fauci and his friends can come along and say, well, we've determined all this. All these studies have shown A, B, C, D, and E. And the court can say, well, yeah, that may be true. Those studies have. But you are infringing on some constitutional rights here. And therefore, we, the judiciary, have the ultimate authority to determine what the facts are. We don't have to defer to the 10 studies you have given us. We can go look at 20 other studies and determine that those 20 other studies are correct and your 10 studies are wrong, because we are litigating a constitutional right. So that deference concept does not apply when you're talking about constitutional right. It cannot possibly apply. And it certainly couldn't apply when you're talking about the Nuremberg principle. All right. So Fauci is completely wrong. But how many other things has he been wrong on? He's been wrong in his own field, let alone being wrong in the legal area. I just wonder why the investigation hasn't proceeded against him. Right? And that again is because of the entrenched nature of the administrative agencies. Somebody has to bring a lawsuit, either within the government, I mean, they could go after him within the government, or somebody external, some citizen who has been aggrieved, right? And then an investigation opens up. we're talking about a case now, in the judicial system. Right, and that's where we get to this question of deference. And he says, "Well, they can't change our, what we've done." And the answer is, "Well, you're wrong. Of course they can. They don't want to. See, this is the problem. They don't want to. The judges don't want to get into this for various reasons. They're afraid. They want to go to the cocktail parties in Georgetown and not be treated as, something, a pariah, or they're ideologically in support of what he's doing. Whatever. There are all sorts of reasons why. But to say that they don't have the authority, completely wrong."
Let's see if we can hit up maybe two more rapid fire of these viewer questions. There's so many, we're not going to have time to get to them all. There's two that are related here. I'll throw them both at you together. Mutant Ryef asks, the Constitution references gold and silver as money. Is it constitutional to allow the U.S. government to be enslaved through debting and having gotten off the gold standard? Related to that is Chang Tin's question. What does, quote, no taxation without representation mean when these days users of the currency are subject to a stealth tax of inflation imposed by the Federal Reserve Central Bank, yet the users of the currency have no representation or say in how the central bank operates?
Well, let's take the second one first. Federal Reserve System is completely unconstitutional. All right. In principle, that kind of a structure was declared unconstitutional unanimously by the Supreme Court in the Schechter Poultry Company case, 1935. All right. The monetary system was not part of the National Industrial Recovery Act, which is the only reason that the Federal Reserve survived. Everything in the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was a cartel structure just like the damn Federal Reserve, was declared unconstitutional. So that's your first problem. He ended up removing the Federal Reserve. These so-called inflationary pressures would be largely controlled. But to get them completely under control, you have to return to the constitutional standard, which is gold and silver. Actually, silver is the monetary unit, but gold and silver are the two forms of money that can be used. Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin, a tender in payment of debts. I mean, there it is. But the other point is that Congress does not have the power directly to issue paper currency, redeemable or irredeemable, right? Because the Federal Reserve is an indirect way of doing this. But Congress doesn't have the power to do that directly through the Treasury. And we know that because the Articles of Confederation gave the Articles of Confederation Congress the power to coin money and emit bills. And those three words, and emit bills, referred to what we call paper currency. When the Constitution was written, that power was proposed for Congress, the power to coin money and emit bills, right? And the and emit bills was stricken. And Article 1, Section 10, which relates, Clause 1, which relates to the state, says, no state shall emit bills of credit. So it was an absolute prohibition against the government of emitting paper currency, whether that paper currency was redeemable or irredeemable. And what happens? Civil War, actually both sides, Confederate government and Union government, issued irredeemable paper currency. That's typically what happens in war. Right? And that's what happened in the colonial period. If you go back to the colonial period prior to the U.S. Constitution, you'll see these statutes or acts or ordinances, whatever they call them at the time. And typically, there'd be one that was raising troops to go fight the French or go fight the Indians or whatever. And the next one was the issue of the emission, as they call it, the emission of bills of credit to pay for the troops. Right? You had this warfare problem. They didn't, or they couldn't raise sufficient taxes directly, gold and silver payment. So they emitted paper currency. That's where, and that's exactly what happened. The same sequence occurs. Civil War, both sides, Union and Confederate, emit paper currency. Right? And after that, the horse was out of the barn. And that was the same time the Union, because the Confederates obviously lost, the Union created the National Currency Act with the national banks, which we still have. And then that was melded into the Federal Reserve System in 1913. So this all goes back to the Civil War. All right? Now, how you get rid of it is a big question, because everything is running on this fictional Federal Reserve note basis. It would probably take a significant amount of time to introduce an alternative currency. I've written about this rather extensively, how it should be done through the states. because the states have this independent authority to make gold and silver coin tender and payment of debts. So they could exercise that, and we would begin to have, in various red states, the rebuilding of a sound monetary system. And then at some stage, obviously, if that succeeded, the Federal Reserve would essentially collapse in competition. But the difficulty is what's the government in Washington, D.C. going to try to do to suppress the activity by the states that would eventually lead to the government in D.C. being unable to use this inflationary mechanism to tax people without representation, because it's run by the banking system, right? The representation here is non-existent because it's the Open Market Committee of the Federal Reserve. It's the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System that are making these decisions. It's these technocrats. And the Open Market Committee is made up not only of members of the Board of Governors, or at least appointed by the President, confirmed by the Senate, but of presidents of certain of the regional banks, which are private banking establishments. That's been held by the courts. They're private entities, private corporations. Whom do they represent? Well, they represent themselves. They don't represent the people in the same sense that members of Congress represent the people, or the president represents the people. They're not subject to election. It's fascinating. Because, you go back to the 1930s, the National Industrial Recovery Act. That's exactly what the National Industrial Recovery Act did. It gave power to what they call the code authorities, which are these cartels in each industry. They gave power to these people, these private groups, to set wages, hours, prices, and so forth and so on, all these economic variables. It goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, that's a concept outside of our law, unknown to our law is the expression they use, unknown to our law, delegating this kind of power to private entities, even though those private entities exercise economic control. Even though, we're giving the power to the people in the steel mills because they know how to make steel. We're giving power to the people in the poultry industry because they know how to raise chickens, whatever. That was the argument that was made to the Supreme Court. We're giving the power to these people because they know how to use it. And the Supreme Court said, again, giving this kind of legislative power to private entities is, and I quote again, unknown to our law. It's not there. You can't find it. And the only reason the Federal Reserve is still here is that the Federal Reserve was the creature of a different statute. If the Federal Reserve had been part of that whole national industrial recovery operation that Roosevelt created in 1933, it would have gone along with the steel cartel and the poultry cartel and the coal cartel, all of them. They all went. But it slipped through because it was the product of an earlier statute. And so we're still operating with it. And it's just as unknown to our law as that code authority for the steel industry was unknown to our law. But because it's tied into the Treasury and it allows this transfer of wealth directly to the U.S. government through the inflation tax, no politician wants to touch it. And I notice that there are no amendments. There are no amendments proposed for this constitutional convention boondoggle that talk about removing the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, and we'll put a link in this description of this video to our prior interview where you walked us through the steps that would be open to states who want to enact legislation at their level for public debts and private debts payable in gold and silver species within them as a potential pathway towards freedom from the central banks through open and honest competition for trustworthy currency. Now, you would think that would be something that someone would be raising. We're going to have a constitutional convention. Let's look at this inflation problem because that's part of the balanced budget. Right. Operation entirely, right? And why aren't we looking at that? Oh, well. Because obviously the Federal Reserve and the people that are, using it to loot the country have so much influence that they can exclude that problem from this constitutional convention. And there's the proof of how dangerous this thing is. That the people who have the real power can exclude, and I would assume can include, what they want to advance their positions or to maintain their positions. This is not going to be a we the people type operation. Constitutional convention. Let's see if we can hit one more hot button before we have to wrap. And this is a question that just keeps being brought up year after year, month after month, when we have different constitutional attorneys on, including yourself. 495 says, can you define the differences between, quote, the United States of America and, quote, all caps, the United States Corporation? And there's a related question. Thomas Massingale says, is an American in the true definition a free person? Is a citizen of the United States an employee of the government by the people? What about this American corporation? What's that all about?
Well, the United States of America is the creation of the U.S. Constitution. All right? That's it. Now, people, when they talk about the U.S. corporation, and in a sense, the United States of America being a legal fiction, right? It's just on paper. Okay, it's a corporate body because it can sue or be sued, it can hold property and so forth and so on, but it has no actual physical personality. There's no person there. Right? When people talk about the U.S. corporation, most of them are referring back to a statute that Congress enacted in the 1870s, creating a municipal corporation for the District of Columbia, which a few years later it repealed. And there's some kind of a theory that that statute somehow made the United States into a corporation which could operate outside of the U.S. Constitution, and that everyone was somehow subject to that corporation and therefore had no real constitutional rights, powers, privileges, immunities, whatever, any legal status under the Constitution. Which on the face of it is nonsense because that statute was repealed a few years later. So what happened there? The point is, Congress, per the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, has complete legislative authority over the District of Columbia. And it has set up from time to time different forms of local government for the District of Columbia. It's used the municipal corporation. It's used a so-called commission form of government where Congress appoints the commissioners. And if we were to follow this theory to its logical or illogical conclusion, we would have to say that the present government of the District of Columbia is the controlling entity in the United States. Muriel Bowser, the mayor of the District of Columbia, is now the most powerful person in the United States, and that all of us are somehow subject to what she and her city council decree. Well, we all know that's nonsense. On the face of it, that's nonsense. And yet, the Muriel Bowser, the municipal corporation of which she is the mayor, is the latest and only surviving government of the District of Columbia. So the whole theory is nonsense. And I don't see how anyone can claim to be an employee of the government of the United States. You're getting paid by them for so many hours of work. And think of typical employment relationship. Could you form a union against them under the National Labor Relations Act? Right? Or are they violating the National Labor Relations Act because they're not allowing you to form a union? We start thinking about some of the practicalities that I think it's really, really absurd. But it comes back to this concept that somehow something changed in the early 1870s when Congress had stipulated other forms of government for the District of Columbia before that. All right, this wasn't the first time they created a governmental structure for the District of Columbia. Right? And it lasted only a few years because apparently the statute was not received well. People had some problems with it. But that's the way the theory goes. And as soon as you recognize that, well, it couldn't possibly be true unless Muriel Bowser and the city council in D.C. was the actual controlling element of the United States today, then the whole thing collapses. The whole argument collapses. I think it's one of those arguments that was created by the, as it were, the intelligence community, if you know what I mean, to create conflict and confusion and dissension among patriots. They create these arguments all the time. I think that's one of them. So now we're worried about whether Muriel Bowser is the one who's dictating everything to us, which we know isn't true. Or I should say, that's what they should be. That's what they should be worried about. They should be worried about something that happened in the 1870s. They should be worried about if that's true. If what happened in the 1870s had this immense change, then Muriel Bowser is the one who's controlling the country. Is that true? No. Ergo, the original theory must be false.
It's been a persistent theme, and it is difficult at times to know how much is it that we're just not educated enough about something versus how much is it that it is, in fact, a red herring to divide and split our focus away from what we need to be paying attention to. We've got more additional questions that we're going to have time to deal with today. We're going to have you back on sooner than we have in the past. But as always, just extremely grateful for your presence here with us. No matter what topic we open up with you, you give us a lot to think about and a better historical context and framework within which to think clearly about it. If people want to follow your work, because you've written, there were some questions we didn't get a chance to that I know you've written about recently. Where can they find your articles and your writing?
Oh, well, if they go to a website called News with Views, all one word, newswithviews.com. And there's a list of authors, or there's a link for all the authors or contributors. And you just go down, scroll down there alphabetically, and you'll find me and click on that, and you'll get the entire archive going back, I don't know when, it's 2005, I think, when I started writing for them. There's quite a bit there.
We're grateful for that and for your presence here with us, and we will commit to getting you back more often so that we can continue to benefit as a community that's growing here. We're almost 69,000 subscribers now that eagerly await your returns. So thank you, Dr. Edwin Vieira, constitutional attorney, for joining us this time again on Liberty and Finance.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Miles Franklin Precious Metals is one of America's oldest and most trusted bullion dealers. Miles Franklin is A+ rated and accredited by the Better Business Bureau, licensed and bonded, and has 0 complaints ever registered. Here at Liberty and Finance, we are licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. To order, simply call us, discuss your needs, and we will let you know our live inventory, prices, and availability, and lock in your order over the phone. Once your order is locked, the price is held for you regardless of market fluctuations, and the metals are reserved for you awaiting your settled payment. Within 1 business day of ordering, you will receive an email invoice detailing the order and payment instructions. Miles Franklin accepts payments by bank wire, ACH or electronic check, money order, check mailed priority mail, and cryptocurrency. The fastest forms of payment are bank wire and cryptocurrency. Upon settled payment, metals will ship out within 3 to 5 business days. You will receive tracking information via email. Domestic shipping charges are $15 for any order under 500 ounces of silver or 10 ounces of gold. For orders larger than that, domestic shipping is free. The package will be double boxed, fully insured, and labeled discreetly, with no indication of the contents inside. For your privacy, the name Miles Franklin will not even be on the package. To talk to myself, Elijah, my brother Kaiser, or my father Dunnigan, call 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.